I hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story. So as you listen to me and you begin to drift comfortably asleep, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or to the words I use, or whether it'll be to the spaces between my words. And while you drift comfortably asleep, I'm just going to talk in the background. Now there was a man who enjoyed the countryside. He had his routines. He enjoyed his routines. He didn't like to deviate from his routines. Every day he would come home from work, he would have something to eat, and he'd go for an evening walk. And he'd walk out of his house. He'd walk down the lane. He'd walk through some woodland, out into a meadow. And he enjoyed his evening walk. He enjoyed the sounds of the birds as he walked down the lane, the sounds of his footsteps, with a slight gravelly sound to each step as he walked, the feeling of the breeze on his face, the way the setting sun illuminated the sky and the clouds. He enjoyed walking through the woodland, the way that in the evening the woodland would begin to go quiet. There'd be the rustling leaves, the soft, dull thud of each footstep. And there'd be a reduction in the sounds of the animals as they started to settle down for the evening. And he enjoyed going to that meadow. And as the sun was setting, so the meadow would take on an orange hue. And this would make all the meadow plants almost look otherworldly, the way they'd sway in the breeze. The last few bees and butterflies going to the plants, visiting those plants, before settling down for the night. And he'd walk through that meadow to the stream. And he'd take his backpack off his back, take a rug out of his backpack that he'd sit on, and he'd sit down next to that stream. He'd take a moment to relax, to appreciate the environment, to listen to that water flowing. And after he feels suitably relaxed, like he's set into this position, he would take a book out of his bag, rest back on his bag while he sat there, open the book at the last page that he'd read, and start to read that book. And he enjoyed these evenings. He enjoyed this familiarity, this routine every evening. And he'd sit there and he'd read that book and let himself get drawn into the story. In this calming and relaxing environment. And this time, while he was reading the story, he found that he felt a little bit more tired than usual. And it was a beautiful evening. And he decided he would just close his eyes for a moment and just rest for a moment. He thought he would just drift a bit like into a meditation just for a moment. Just drifting and dreaming a moment. And while he began to drift and dream with his eyes closed, he started to hear a pinging sound. And he looked around him and realized he was on a submarine. And he realized this submarine was tiny and he was even smaller, and that this was a submarine in the stream. He could recognize the way the ground looked like the stream that he knows and is familiar with. And he could see these giant fish that he knew were really just small average fish. And he could hear the pinging of the sonar. And as he put a periscope above the surface of the water, he could see himself lying on the shore, asleep. And he thought this was a really unusual situation. And he tried to wake up. And found that he just seemed to be in this submarine. That him as this small person in this small submarine didn't have control to wake the him on the side of the stream up. And he didn't really like this uncertainty, this lack of control. He liked his routines. He liked doing the same thing, the same way, over and over again. He started guiding the submarine around, wondering how he's going to get out of this, how he can wake himself up. He tried to slap himself around the face, and that didn't work. He tried to crash the submarine into the ground, and that didn't work. It just dented the submarine. He couldn't find any way to wake himself up. And after what seemed like hours, he started to resign himself to the fact that he was here on this submarine. And he started to learn that he had to go with the flow, make the most of the experience, and see what he can learn from the experience. And so he started steering the submarine around, started realizing that in this submarine he can get to see the underwater in this stream from a perspective he had never seen before. He'd sat beside the stream and looked in, but had never seen it as clear as this or as close up as this. And so he drove the submarine around exploring the stream. And then he found what looked like a cave. And so he drove the submarine into a cave and started exploring down the cave. And part way down the cave, he noticed it was getting so dark, so he turned the lights on. And it was quite a long cave. Until eventually it came out in a larger cave with an air pocket above the water. And he rose the submarine up in that area. And he opened the hatch in the top of the submarine, popped his head out and looked around. And the submarine's lights shone into the cave. And he could see that in this cave was a family of water voles, all snuggled up and sleeping. And he had never seen water voles this close up. He'd caught glimpses of them from time to time, but as soon as he got a camera to try and point a camera at them, they would dart away and seemed very shy. And yet here he could see them close up as a family, relaxing, sleeping, and paying no attention to the submarine at all. He climbed back fully into the submarine, closed the lid, dived back down into the water, and headed back the way he came. He then carried on further down the stream. He passed different fish. Some he'd seen and recognised, others he'd never seen before. And then he reached an unusual structure, and he knew automatically what it was, although he'd never seen it from this position. He knew that there were beavers here somewhere. He travelled into it in his submarine, popped out and could see the beavers, curled up, sleeping and relaxing. And he was surprised at how peaceful all these creatures looked as he dived the submarine again and carried on down the stream. He knew this was some kind of a dream, and he knew that he hadn't figured out how to wake up. But he also knew that he was beginning to learn something. He just didn't quite know what yet. And as he carried on down the stream, suddenly the submarine started to speed up. And he tried to slow it down, but it was just speeding up faster and faster. And he didn't seem to be able to slow it down, and he couldn't figure out why. And then he realised he was heading towards some rapids. And he'd totally forgotten that further downstream it turns into rapids and it gets faster as it heads down and down and down and down all the way to a lake. And he tried to steer the submarine left and right. He tried to decide where it was going to go, but he seemed to have no control over it. So in the end he realised that all he could do was to nudge the submarine gently, to let it go where it's going to go, but make sure that it's going where it's going to go in a slightly more controlled way. He couldn't choose the path, but he could affect how rough or smooth that path was. And so he focused his attention and focused on just nudging that submarine so that it would follow the path, but do it as smoothly and as safely as possible. And that submarine travelled all the way down until suddenly it leapt from the top of a waterfall, splashed down in the small bit of river below, and calmly floated out into the lake. And the man was pleased that he'd survived the experience without any kind of injury and with no damage to the submarine, and that he was now in this calm lake. And he'd never seen underwater in the lake, so while he was here he decided he would dive down and take a look at what it's like deep under the lake. And as he explored, he could see waving fronds of underwater grasses and sea and weeds and other green plants. He could see fish hiding among the underwater plants, and larger fish just swimming openly in the lake. And the water in the lake was a little bit more murky than in the stream he'd come from. And yet he felt a comfort with the slowness, with the way that everything seemed to move almost in slow motion. He felt a comfort with the way the light seemed to be quite even from whatever direction. It was more a glow than a light. And he started to gain a new appreciation for the nature he normally didn't pay such close attention to. He started to realize that he would get so hung up on making sure he follows his routines, on making sure everything goes smoothly as he wants it to, that he would have the same things he would pay attention to every time he went somewhere. He would pay attention to the same things whenever he walked through the woods. He'd pay attention to the same things and appreciate the same things in the meadow. He'd follow the same routine of putting his rug down, of reading his book. And he realized that he'd get so hung up on just following the same routines and noticing the same things that he missed huge amounts of other things of equal importance. And he realized that he had a sense of love for nature that he knew he had. He just didn't know he had it. He'd never really appreciated that he had a love for nature. He would think to himself how he noticed the bees and butterflies on the plants. He would think to himself how he noticed the sounds of the trees as the wind blew a breeze. But he didn't realize that he had a deep connection to all this, a deep love for the nature. And just as he started realizing this, he began to fall asleep in the submarine. And as he began to fall asleep in the submarine, so he began to stir and wake up on the bank of that stream. And as he began to wake up on the bank of that stream, he started to wonder about the experience, about the oddity of the experience. He started to wonder, why had he had such an unusual experience? What could it all mean? He'd come back with this deep sense of love and appreciation for the natural environment he was in. He felt like he was more aware of the environment than he had been, and that this dream had been unusual in its vividity. And as he gazed around him, he noticed there was a little submarine bobbing up and down in the stream. And he walked over to the stream, reached in, and picked up that submarine, and noticed it was just a small little toy submarine, and he wondered whether somehow he'd unconsciously spotted that submarine and somehow integrated it into his dream. And he wandered along the edge of the stream, the sun barely lighting up the area now, almost totally set. In fact, it had already gone over the horizon, and it was more just the light from the sky, from the way the sun bounces around in the atmosphere, that was lighting the area. And he walked past a beaver's home. He'd walked past the beginning of the rapids. He'd walked all the way to the waterfall, and he gazed down and he could see the lake. And he gazed out over the lake, and he wondered how he knew that all this was here like this. And then he walked back to his rug, sat down on his rug, and started thinking for a bit about the experience, started processing the experience in his mind, processing this new love and appreciation for the natural world, and this new way of thinking about things where sometimes you have to be comfortable with uncertainty, sometimes you have to be comfortable with not knowing. And he had never thought about himself as being able to be comfortable with uncertainty. And yet he recalled being in the submarine, going down the rapids, being out of control, and doing the bit that he can control, and leaving the rest to itself, and how that made him feel more in control, because he had let go of the bits that were out of his control. And he took so many learnings from this experience and thought it was the most incredible dream and the most unusual dream, and somehow something, maybe a part of himself, maybe something wider, something deeper, something more profound, had been teaching him a lesson. And he packed his things up as the light was almost gone. And he walked back, he walked through the woods. He walked through that meadow, through the woods, and he walked all the way home. And once home, he decided to go to bed and see if he would continue this learning and this dreaming in this new way. And he went to bed and drifted comfortably and deeply asleep.